Picture this. You're standing in line at a coffee shop, and for the first time in years, you don't do the mental math. You don't calculate whether ordering that drink means skipping something else later. You just order it. Not because you suddenly became rich overnight, not because some windfall landed in your lap, but because something quietly shifted in your brain and you don't even fully understand why yet. That moment, that specific psychological exhale, it has a number attached to it. And it's probably not the number you've been told to chase. Most financial content you'll find online is obsessed with the big milestones. The six-figure salary, the $1 million portfolio, the paid-off house. And while those things are genuinely worth working toward, they completely skip over the milestone that actually changes how you think about money in the first place. The one that rewires your brain before any of the bigger wins become possible. That number is $20,000. My name is Raymond, and I've spent more time than I probably should thinking about the psychology of money, the mechanics of wealth building, and why certain people seem to naturally accelerate financially while others stay stuck in the same patterns for decades despite genuinely wanting something different. Today, I want to talk about what actually happens when you hit $20,000 in savings, not just the math, though we're definitely going to get into the math, but the stuff that happens in your head, in your career, in your daily decisions that nobody really explains clearly. Let's start with the thing most people feel but can't articulate. When you don't have savings, your brain operates in a mode that psychologists sometimes call scarcity mindset. Every single financial decision gets filtered through a lens of fear. You take the first job offer that comes along not because it's right, but because you can't afford to wait. You stay in situations that drain you because leaving feels too dangerous. You say yes to things you don't want to do because the money attached to them feels necessary for survival. This isn't a character flaw. It's not weakness or poor discipline. When you're living close to the financial edge, your brain genuinely cannot allocate the same mental bandwidth to long-term thinking that it can when you feel secure. Research out of Princeton and Harvard found that financial scarcity actually consumes cognitive resources in a way that reduces effective decision-making capacity. Your mental processor is running too many background programs just to keep the lights on, and there's not enough left over to think strategically about your future. Now, here's where $20,000 becomes important. A study from Vanguard found that having just $2,000 in emergency savings increased financial well-being scores by 21%. $2,000. That's less than most people spend on a used laptop or a weekend getaway. And yet that small buffer produced the largest measurable boost of any single financial factor they studied. When you push that number to 3 to 6 months of living expenses, which for most people lands somewhere in the neighborhood of $20,000, you get another meaningful jump in well-being. But more critically, you've cleared enough psychological runway for your brain to finally shift from survival mode into something else entirely. Instead of asking, how do I get to next Friday, you start asking, where do I want to be in 5 years? That shift sounds simple. It is anything but. It's the entire game. Let's talk about what the math actually looks like once you have $20,000 working for you, because this is where things start to get genuinely exciting. Assume you're saving $1,000 a month and earning around 8% annually on your investments. Getting from zero to your first $20,000 takes roughly 19 months. A year and a half of consistent discipline, delayed gratification, and saying no to things you probably wanted. That's genuinely hard, and the majority of people who start never finish it. But here's the part that changes everything. Your second $20,000 doesn't take another 19 months, it takes about 17. Because now you've got that first chunk working alongside your contributions, generating its own returns, doing its own share of the lifting. You did the same work, saved the same amount, took on no additional risk, and shaved 2 months off the timeline simply because momentum started working for you instead of against you. By the time you're going for your third $20,000, it compresses further. Your fourth, further still. And once you've built a portfolio somewhere around $400,000, you can generate a new $20,000 in roughly 5 months without changing your saving rate at all. The work you did in that first brutal 19 months created a machine that eventually does the work for you. That first milestone feels like pushing a boulder uphill through wet concrete. Every milestone after it gets progressively easier. Because gravity starts working in your favor instead of against you, people hear about compound interest their whole lives and nod politely like it's a nice idea. They don't actually feel it until they've crossed a threshold where the numbers start moving fast enough to be visible. 20,000 is often that threshold. It's when compound interest stops being a concept and starts being a thing that happens to your money in a way you can actually watch. But I want to spend some time on something that most financial conversations completely skip over because the psychological changes are honestly just as important as the mathematical ones. When you've saved $20,000, you've proven something to yourself that cannot be faked or shortcut. You prove that you can control money instead of the other way around. You prove that you can delay gratification for months and sometimes years in pursuit of something that matters to you. That proof changes your identity in a quiet but profound way. Before that milestone, every small financial decision feels loaded. Should I get the name brand or the generic? Is this coffee worth it? Can I afford this, or am I just telling myself I can? These micro decisions consume real mental energy because every dollar feels precious and uncertain. After you've built that foundation, you stop sweating the small decisions because you already have evidence that you can make the big ones correctly when it counts. You're not worried about the $3 coffee because you know you're someone who can save $20,000. That identity carries more weight than any single purchase. Decision. Here's what else changes that people don't talk about enough. You start noticing opportunities that were always there but completely invisible to you before. A friend mentions they're starting a small business and looking for early investors. Before, you might have thought that sounds interesting and moved on. Now you can actually evaluate whether it makes sense to put $5,000 toward it. A property in your area needs work and is listed below market. Before, you scroll past it. Now you have the resources to at least run the numbers and see if the deal makes sense. Your company is sending people to an industry conference, but they're not covering the full cost. Before, you make an excuse. Now you weigh the career investment and make a decision based on actual return, not just immediate cash flow. This is what people mean when they say money makes money. It's not some cosmic favoritism toward the already wealthy. It's that capital creates options, and options create the ability to act when something worth acting on appears. The opportunities don't multiply. Your ability to see and respond to them does. Now let's talk about what happens to your career once you've crossed this threshold. Because this is something I think about a lot and it doesn't get nearly enough attention. When you're living paycheck to paycheck, your relationship with your employer is fundamentally unequal. You need the next check more than they need you specifically. That dynamic, even when it's unspoken, shapes every interaction you have at work. You don't push back on things you should push back on. You accept assignments that don't serve your growth because saying no feels risky. You don't ask for the raise you've earned because somewhere in the back of your mind you're afraid of what happens if they decide they're done with you. That fear doesn't have to be conscious to be real. It shapes your behavior in ways you might not even recognize. $20,000 changes that dynamic completely. Not because you're going to quit tomorrow, not because you're looking to burn anything down, but because you now have what I call walking away money. You could leave your current situation and survive comfortably for months while you figured out what comes next. That knowledge changes your posture in every conversation you have at work. You become more direct, more willing to advocate for yourself, more comfortable with the temporary discomfort of conflict because the worst case scenario is no longer catastrophic. Here's the fascinating part. You often don't even need to use that cushion for it to do its job. Just having it changes how you carry yourself and people notice. You get better assignments, you get more visibility. And here's the thing that completes the loop. You earn more money, which means you build your savings faster, which gives you even more options and even more confidence. It becomes a reinforcing cycle that accelerates over time, but it has to start somewhere, and it starts with that first 20,000. Let's take a minute to look at what happens when people do the opposite of this, because I see it all the time and it's worth understanding clearly. The car payment situation in America is genuinely staggering. The average new car payment has crossed $700 a month. For trucks and SUVs, which have become the default choice for millions of buyers, payments routinely exceed $900, sometimes $1,200. Over a 7-year loan, which has become completely normalized, a person spending $900 a month on a vehicle will pay over $75,000 total and end up with an asset worth maybe $15,000. Add insurance, fuel, and maintenance on top of that, and you're looking at more than $130,000 spent over 7 years on something that ends up being worth almost nothing. Now, run the same numbers a different direction. If that same person had invested $900 a month instead of spending it on a depreciating truck, they'd have close to $100,000 after 7 years, assuming basic index fund returns. The difference between those two outcomes is not income. It's not opportunity. It's a single decision about what to do with that monthly cash flow. This is the opportunity cost conversation that almost nobody has at the car dealership. because the car dealership has zero incentive to have it with you. They're not selling you transportation. They're selling you an identity, a feeling of success and status that feels real in the moment, but is costing you the actual financial freedom that would make you genuinely feel secure. $20,000 in savings is incompatible with that kind of thinking. Once you've experienced what it feels like to have real financial breathing room, driving a paid-off, reliable car while your investment account grows actually feels like the smart choice, not the deprivation choice. The psychology flips entirely. The same principle applies to housing decisions. The math on what it actually takes to afford a $500,000 house in 2025 is brutal, and almost nobody does it honestly. If you put 10% down, you're borrowing $450,000. At current interest rates, your mortgage payment alone is somewhere around $2,800 a month. Add property taxes, insurance, maintenance reserves, and PMI, and you're looking at total monthly housing costs closer to $4,300 or $4,400. To keep that payment at the recommended 28% of income, you need to be earning close to $190,000 annually. Using the more lenient 43% rule, you still need roughly $150,000. Only about 10 to 20% of American households earn that much. The system around home buying has very little incentive to tell you this math. The bank gets paid on the loan, the agent gets paid on the commission, the title company gets paid on the closing. Nobody in that chain profits from you deciding the purchase doesn't make sense. So nobody does that math with you. $20,000 in savings gives you enough perspective to do the math yourself and actually make a decision based on what the numbers say instead of what the pressure around you is suggesting. Now, I want to address something directly because this is where a lot of people trip and undo the progress they worked so hard to make. Hitting $20,000 feels like an achievement because it is one. And the temptation is to celebrate by treating it as a reward. Maybe a nicer car feels justified now that you've been so disciplined. Maybe a vacation seems earned. Maybe you're eyeing a house and this feels like the down payment moment. I'm not saying you should never spend money on things you enjoy. Joyless financial discipline isn't the point and it's not sustainable, but I want you to understand clearly what $20,000 actually represents in the context of building wealth. It's not a reward for past behavior. It's the foundation that makes every future milestone possible. A 10% return on $2,000 is $200. Nice, but it doesn't materially change your life. A 10% return on $20,000 is $2,000. That's a month of living expenses for many people, generated entirely by money that was already sitting there. Keep that foundation intact, and the next milestone comes faster. Spend it and reset to zero, and you're back to pushing that boulder uphill from scratch. The people who build generational wealth are not the ones who celebrate each milestone by spending down to it. They're the ones who treat each milestone as the new floor to build from. Let's bring this all together with what the research actually tells us about where most people end up. The average American saves about 6% of their income. The median retirement savings across all age groups is around $65,000. And about a quarter of Americans have no retirement savings at all. The average household carries more than $9,000 in credit card debt at interest rates that frequently exceed 20%. The average car payment has now surpassed the monthly retirement contribution for most households. These aren't just statistics, they're a picture of what happens when people spend their entire financial lives reacting instead of building, when every dollar earned is already claimed by debt, lifestyle, and obligations before it can be redirected toward the future. The antidote to that picture is not a six-figure salary, though that certainly helps. It's not a lucky investment or a side hustle that takes off. Those things are fine when they happen, but they're not the mechanism. The mechanism is the $20,000 foundation that breaks you out of survival mode and gives compound interest something to actually work with. Once you have that foundation, the math gets better automatically. Your career trajectory improves because you negotiate from strength. Your investment returns become visible and motivating. Your decisions stop being driven by fear and start being driven by strategy. And the gap between where you are and where you want to be starts closing faster than you probably expect. The hardest part is that first 19 months. The first time you build to that level, you're doing it without momentum, without the psychological evidence that you can do it, and without any visible acceleration in your numbers. It just feels like grinding while nothing changes. But here's the thing about that phase that's actually important to understand. You are not just accumulating money during that period. You are building the identity, the habits, and the self knowledge that make everything after it sustainable. The discipline you practice during that stretch doesn't disappear when you hit the goal. It becomes the way you operate. Most people who successfully build to 20,000 don't stop there. Not because some external force pushes them forward, but because the identity they built to get there naturally continues. You've become someone who understands money, who manages it intentionally, and who knows from experience that patience and discipline produce results that feel almost like magic once the compounding really kicks in. That's not luck. It's not a secret available only to people who grew up wealthy or graduated from the right schools. It's math and psychology working together in your favor once you give them the raw material to work with. Start there. Protect it once you have it. And let time do the rest. Your future self is building their life on the foundation you create. Right now, the decision you make this month about where your money goes matters more than you probably think it does in this moment. It always does.